Hi, Karen Alari here. We're going to paint this little river scene today. I'm using golden acrylic paints. The colors are scrolling along the bottom, and I'm using some flat brushes. I've got a size 6, 4, and 2 there, as well as a small round brush and a liner brush, and there's my water container. I also use a little spritzer bottle full of water. It just gives a fine misty spray to keep the paints moist as we're painting along. I'm using a Masterston Stay Wet palette and with some wet paper towels and a piece of palette paper on top of that. Starting out here with my size 6 brush, and I'm using my Hansa yellow medium and my Napthol Red Light and a little bit of white I've added in there. Also adding some Quin Gold to this mix. So what I'm doing here is just mixing up a color to tone my canvas with. It doesn't really matter what color this is. You can literally do any color that you want because we'll be covering most of it up. But it just fills up the tooth of the canvas and gives you a nice surface to paint on. And that's why I do the toning. Again, color is not important. This is my little liner, round brush I mean. It's probably about a size 2 round brush, maybe a 4. And I'm marking off the thirds on each side of my canvas and where those thirds intersect. And what that does is just help you know how to place the items in your image. Compose your painting as best as you can, because it's good to put a focal point in one of those areas where those thirds intersect. It's just a nice little compositional idea. So the photo I'm using today as a reference is one that was taken by my friend Larry Roberts, and I'm starting by just sketching in the large shapes. I'm really thinking here about light and shadow, and then just a roadmap, just some general placement of where I'm going to be putting the big shapes. So I've got the edge of the rocks there where the water starts. I've got a tree. I've got the light area that I've indicated on the rocks. And now I'm just putting in those little bushes over to the left and the far river bank. That diagonal line I'm putting in is indicating where the shadow stops in those background trees and the light starts. So that's really where you want to be keeping your mind thinking about in this, especially in this first part of a painting, is where's the light and where is the shadow, where are the lights and where are the darks, because that's really gonna define your painting. I switched over to my number 4 brush now. This is a flat brush, which I use mostly. I'm using my Ultramarine Blue, and I mixed up a little bit of quite a bit of the Hansa yellow medium in with that, or Hansa yellow opaque, I've also seen it called. So here I'm mixing some blue. I used some Pthalo Blue that time, some Alizarin Crimson, and some of that Quinacridone Gold, and that just makes a really dark. If you don't have the Quin Gold or you don't have that blue, don't worry about it. Just mix whatever red, yellow, and blue you have together, and whenever you do that, you're going to get a very dark color that's really neutral. And I like to use that instead of using a black straight out of the tube. I think it just has a little more interest and depth to it. So I added some green to that just to lighten it up a little bit. Adding some red now and some yellow, and adding those to the green are going to make it a little warmer, a little more muted in color and a little bit warmer. And really what I'm thinking about in this stage of the painting, which would be called the block-in stage, is where are those darks. So you can see I started out with identifying where in the painting are my darks. These are the darks in the distance, and you notice I added a little bit of white to that, and also a little bit of blue, because as you move back in your painting, you want to be really careful to make sure that your darks get a little bit lighter, a little bit more muted, a little bit bluer as you move into the background. And that'll help you really have some nice depth in your painting. You want to keep all those darkest darks way up front in the foreground. So as I'm going, I'm also adding in the reflections, because those are just as much a part of this painting as the rest of it. So go ahead and add those reflections as you go. You have that paint already mixed up, you know what those paint colors are. And you'll notice when I do reflections, I just keep my brush real flat and just pull those colors straight down. And that's going to be more obvious later in the painting as we start refining it a little bit more. But at this stage, I just want you to be aware of that. Okay, so thinking about some lighter values now, and I wiped off some of that stuff that I put too much dark underneath because the paint was still wet and it's mixing together, and I want to establish a light area right there. I'm really just thinking about big shapes and values. How light is it? How dark is it? And I'm also trying to get colors that are pretty close, but my focus is really those values and getting those right. So now I'm thinking about the shadows on the rocks that we have going on behind there. Just the big shapes, not looking at any detail. You're also going to notice that this playback is sped up just a little bit. I didn't want the video to go too long and get too uninteresting, because I'm a pretty slow painter. But if you want to see it in a slower version, you know, you can always go into the settings on YouTube and slow the video down a little bit and watch it that way. So now mixing up some colors for the lights. So just some red and some yellow, and really throughout this painting I use both of those two reds interchangeably. One is a Quin Red and one is a Napthol Red medium, and you really only need one red and that will work fine for you. So I'm just thinking about where those light shapes are, thinking about where the sunlight is and where the shadow is. We're just about at the end of figuring out what our biggest shapes are going to be, what our major block-in shapes are going to be. Just adding some more, thinking about what colors are going to be going behind that tree, whether it's going to be shadow or light. And here comes a value mixed up to make that foreground tree that's lighter. So I've got one tree that's darker and one tree because it's in shadow, and then one tree that's in sunlight, which I think makes for a really interesting composition. Here's just some blue I'm mixing up, a light blue, to indicate where those blue reflections of the sky are. It really helps in this stage to squint your eyes when you're looking at your reference photo. And if you squint your eyes, you lose all that detail and you just see those big shapes. And that's really all you want to think about at this point. So that's pretty much, I would call that done for my block-in. And now I'm going to think about starting to refine my shapes a little bit. I'm starting with this biggest tree, this biggest darkest tree here in the foreground, and I'm just adding some different colors now, focusing more on color. Getting interest in the painting really depends on these constant little shifts of color. So, you know, maybe you know that your tree is green, but it may have 5 or 10 different shades of green within the tree. You just have to be careful to remember which areas are sunlight and which areas are shadow. Keep your lights all in the same light values and your darks in the similar dark values, and that way you won't lose that contrast between light and dark. Just mixing up sort of a neutralized brownish color. You know, the way to neutralize color, if it's too bright, what you're trying to do is always just to add a touch of the complement to that color. So you see I was mixing up an orange there with red and yellow, and in order to make it a little more muted, a little more neutral, I added a touch of blue to that. Again, that gives you a little better, more interesting color than just having black on your palette or gray and just adding gray to your color. Using the complement makes for more vibrant colors in your painting. You know, whenever you add white to make a color lighter, the white will cool your color off a little bit. So you noticed when I was adding white to the green there to make the more sunlit side, I added a little bit of yellow as well. Now adding some blue to give some more shadow and make some sort of interim colors. And then including those reflections as I go. And you'll watch as I do this throughout the painting, I continue to adjust those reflections so they match what's going on above, but not in a mirror-like way. I rinsed out my brush there and dried most of the water out of it just in order to smooth out and soften the edges of the paint that's going to be the reflections. And then a few horizontal brush strokes, and that all just helps to keep it looking like reflections in the water. Again, I'm checking out my reference photo and looking for those big shifts of color and value. And it's a matter of building up. I think it's important to move all over your canvas as you're painting and build it up together, not necessarily finish one area to the complete, detail, but instead keep with the bigger brushes as long as you can and move from big shapes, and then later in the painting move into the more and more refined shapes, depending on how far you want to go. You can stop at any level of refinement with the painting. Once you get your big shapes in and your values, then it just becomes personal choice of how loose you want the painting to be. I usually fall somewhere in the middle. I keep more detail near my focal point and then less detail in the periphery areas. It's all just a matter of experimentation, really, with painting. I'm never quite sure how I'm going to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. So I just try things. If I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, I just ask myself, what if I try this color or this brush? You notice I've moved over to my number 2 brush now, moving again from big shapes into smaller shapes. And as I'm wanting to start painting the shadows on the rocks, and you'll notice in the reference photo there's lots of little nooks and crannies and shapes in these rocks. I really find that the painting of rocks is very experimental for me, because rocks can come in any shape and size and any color. A lot of these rocks that we're painting here have been around the water for a long time, so they have a lot of soft edges, especially those rocks that are closer to the water. So they're kind of smooth and not a lot of sharp edges to them. But sometimes rocks are very sharp. So I'm using these shadow colors with various blues and reds, whites mixed together, and again just kind of experimenting and seeing what looks good. It's always important to test that paint color you just mixed up on the canvas and see how it looks. I'm painting negatively here, which means I had that big block of greenish colors, and I'm coming back around it now with the shadow color which is behind in order to shape it up a little bit more. I think another thing that beginners often do, well, and I still do, is not use enough paint on your brush. If you want to get those big, juicy, loose-looking brush strokes, it's super important to have a lot of paint on your brush. So mix up big piles of paint and be generous with your paint. And you'll get those, it'll move more smoothly, and you'll get better definition to what you're trying to do. Again, I'm going back and forth, painting negatively and painting positively. And that's what I think gives you some really interesting shapes versus just laying down a background and then painting something on top of it. That would be positive painting. It just gives you some more interesting shapes to just paint around what you've already put down in a negative painting way. Again, just moving in and refining those shapes a little bit more. I keep looking at my reference photo and finding shapes I like and then placing them down. In some areas, the thing you work with acrylics is their fast dry time, which is very advantageous in a lot of ways but can be frustrating. So you just have to, if you move quickly, you can do some blending right away, just staying within a small area and blending as you go. Back to defining that tree trunk again. Negative painting. If you put in a tree trunk and it feels kind of big and clunky or not interesting enough, you just bring in your leaf color like I was doing, and you can make it smaller, or you can adjust the shape of it with that negative painting. Here I'm doing the same negative painting idea with a sort of a mid-tone there. It's a brownish color. Some of my dark that I mixed up earlier with some light added to it. You can see how I'm defining the shape of that tree. It's a great technique. I've been practicing using that more lately because I really like the effect. The other thing I do as I paint in acrylics, you start generally with the darker colors and then paint lighter colors over the top of them, though, as I was mentioning, there's a lot of back and forth with the negative painting and positive painting, which you can do with acrylics because they're drying, so you can move right over with another layer within minutes. Just looking at those shapes, what's going through my mind is just checking a spot on the reference photo and then looking at those shapes. I really try not to think about, oh well, I'm painting a tree now, or I'm painting water now, or I'm painting a reflection. I'm just looking for shapes and colors and values and edges. That's what everything is in painting, is those things: shapes, color, value, and edges. Again, as I'm doing reflections, I'll soften up those edges. And then I'll do a few horizontal strokes. Best way to do that is just to rinse your brush off real well, dry most of the water out of it, and then you can soften up the edges before it dries completely. I'm using this Quin Gold quite a bit when I'm making these greens. It's a nice earthy, transparent, dark yellow, and so I like to use it, but you don't necessarily have to use it. If you take your yellow and add just a touch of red to it, you'll get a really similar color. You might need a little touch of blue as well, but that works well. You don't have to have that Quin Gold. I'm making some rocks now, thinking about where some of these rocks are going to be in the water. So I started with a dark to indicate the bottom of the rocks. And now I'm looking at some shapes that the rocks might be. I'm kind of following the reference photo and also a little bit following what I might what looks good to me. That grayer area in the back, putting in there's sort of a sandy, beachy area in shadow back there that I'm putting in. Varieties of color, and then in the shadow staying within those darker values, and that gives you texture and makes it look interesting. You'll notice that reflections, when something is very close to the reflection, it's going to be a little more distinct, and then as you get further away, sort of more towards us, the reflections get softer and a little less defined. Mixing up some orange here with the red and yellow, and adding some white. Because there's areas on these sunlit rocks that are a little bit lighter, just a little bit different value, different color, and that's going to add the interest to it. You noticed that was an orange, so I added a tad bit of blue to it to make it a little more neutral, not quite so bright. Adding your complementary colors for neutralizing is a really important thing to know how to do. And of course, we've got a few rocks down here along the shoreline that are in sunlight. So I'm going to add those too while I've got that color going on. Rocks are fun to paint. I like to paint rocks, but it's really I always feel like I'm feeling my way with rocks. You need a shadow side, you need a light side, but you also need sort of a variety of colors within each of those. You got to think, it's super important to think about, where is my light coming from? And the light is going to hit those rocks on this left side because our light is pretty high in the sky, but it's coming from the left and hitting those rocks. So we're going to put in some shadows and some light parts to them. And of course, right along the bottom, there's always a little bit of darker colors. I have a Facebook group called Paint with Karen that I would like to invite you to join if you're painting along with me today, and share your paintings. I'd love to see them, and there's a whole bunch of other painters on there that we can share what we've done and encourage each other. Or if you ran into a specific problem and you'd like me to help you, you can always ask me questions on there and I'll get back with you. More blues, more shaping of that big blobs of green I have back there, turning them into something that resembles a few more bushes or trees off to the right. I don't want that area to be really defined. I don't want a lot of detail over there, because your viewer's eye will fill all that in. Okay, a little shift in my position there. But we should still be able to see pretty well. Thinking about those reflections and what's above there that I can reflect into the water. So you want to keep in mind when you're doing reflections that the lights in the water reflection are going to be a little bit darker and the darks are going to be a little bit lighter. That's the only thing you really have to worry about. And again, keeping the edges soft, and just don't worry about trying to create a mirror image, or don't try to paint it exactly the same way as you painted the above part, because you want to clue the viewer in that this is a reflection. So you can do that by keeping your edges soft. I'm giving my paints a little bit of a spritz with my water bottle there, because they do tend to dry out on the palette. Alright, mixing up some more dark with blue and Alizarin Crimson. Again, if you don't have the Alizarin Crimson, just mix your blue and your red together, whatever versions of blue and red you have. I'll often, when I'm painting, I didn't do it this time, but I'll often mix up a big pile of my secondary colors. So I'll make a big pile of green with my red and with my yellow and blue, and a big pile of orange and a big pile of purple, and that just makes things go a little quicker when you're painting. I generally don't use tube colors for my secondary colors, because using a limited palette, just one or two, basically one red, one yellow, and one blue, will keep your painting very unified. The colors are going to be very harmonious with each other. So if you're having trouble with that, with your paintings just not feeling harmonious, or being unsure of what color to choose, just choose one red, one yellow, and one blue and white, and mix all of your secondary colors, and you'll find that everything comes out really blending together nicely. It takes a lot of the confusion out of it, out of color mixing. And when I'm mixing those colors, I'm just thinking in terms of, I'll start with a mix. What color is this closest to? So if it's a brown color I'm looking for, I'll mix red and yellow together to get an orange. And then if I want it to be brown, I'll mix in a little bit of that complementary blue, because that's going to neutralize that color. You'll notice as I go on in the painting, I'm making smaller and smaller shapes. sort of refining those shapes by looking at the reference photo and just looking for the shape, the color, the value, and the edge in any particular location. I just thought it might look good to add a little bit of some trunks up there, but as you can notice, I just covered them right back up. I didn't like the way that looked. So much of painting is just give it a try, and if it looks good, leave it in, and if it doesn't, just try something else. Acrylics are very forgiving that way. Just paint another layer right over the top, either right away or let it dry and come back. Thinking about this bluer sky reflection area up here and how bright of a color I want to use. I know I don't want to use anything very bright because this is way at the bottom of the painting and it's not an area where I want to have a lot of attention. Experimenting with some more colors of blue-greens to make more interest in the tree. Acrylics always dry darker, so a lot of times you have to, when you first put something down, it may seem a little bit too light, but it's going to settle back in and dry darker. So my motto is, if it looks too light, it's just about right. This tree's got some sunlight hitting it over here on the left side too. I'm playing that up a little bit more, just for interest. Because this area here with the two trees and the sunlit rocks, that whole area in there is where I want the eye to go. You can make tiny little marks with a flat brush using the very corner of your brush. It has lots of different possibilities. Using the top edge, you can make a nice thin line, or using the corner you can make a little tiny spot, or using the big flat areas you can make bigger shapes. Experiment with that. You'll find you can make lots of different shapes. It's important to move your brush around, change the orientation of your brush. I've kind of flip it over back and forth quite a few times, especially when I'm doing foliage, and I try to move my hand around so that all the brush strokes aren't going in the same direction. Coming back, using negative painting again to create some of these background trees, and you notice my colors back there are bluer and lighter because I want to keep that distance, a feeling of distance, so I can move into those big shapes, cut out around them, and create sort of a tree form by doing that. I'll be doing more later, so this is kind of like a first layer of adding texture, and I'm working negatively, and then I'll do some positive work and come back to negative work, so it's a push and pull. And you'll notice I'm exaggerating the colors, so in other words, the greens back there in the reference photo look warmer, and I'm exaggerating the coolness of these colors, again in order to push them back further into the distance. There's a lot of things you have to think about when working from a photo and adjust. Of course, this is a really nice photo. It's well planned and well executed, so the colors and the values aren't too skewed. But in some photos, especially the ones I take, which I just kind of shoot real quickly with my cell phone, oftentimes I have to adjust because the lights are too light and or the darks are too dark, which is really common in a photo. Because the camera has to choose either to bring out the lights in order, keep the brightness down in order to see the detail in the brights, or it has to brighten up in order to see the details in the darks. So getting that wide range where you can see some interest in details in everything is kind of tough when you're working from a photo. So you have to realize that and adjust for it when you're making your painting. You notice I brought in some bluer tones and did a few tree trunks there. I'm not trying to reproduce exactly what's in the photo. I'm just trying to give the viewer the idea, and they can fill in the rest. Remember when I was doing the block in and I had that diagonal line going, showing the shadowed part of the trees. You got a few dark trees coming up vertically, but mostly, you see that part that's in shadow and the part in light. So you really want to focus on keeping that. Keeping all the values in the dark area dark and all the values in the light area lighter. You can switch colors. As you can see here, I'm switching to some bluer tones because you don't want it just to all look green. That would be boring. We don't want boring. The more shapes I add, the more smaller shapes you add, then the more interest and the more texture and the more it starts to come to life. So you don't have to worry and think about how do I paint this tree. You just look at the shapes. Paint the shapes and the colors and the values. Talking a lot about value in this video, which I always do in my videos because value is so important. Getting the darks and lights and the midtones right is super important. I'm sorry I scooched my painting over and the edge of it got off of the screen a little bit, but hopefully you can at least see what I'm doing and which colors I'm using. By now I've got so many different blues and greens mixed up on my palette there that I can just grab a little bit and mix different things together and add a little bit of red or yellow or something and get lots and lots of different varieties of greens. Of course, white is always added to lighten the color. And I'm not worrying as much back in this area. When I add the white, I don't necessarily have to add yellow as I normally would because I want the color to be cooler back there. Adding a few more of those blue tree trunks going on. Alright, I've got my green, adding a little bit of that Quin Gold to it, warm it up a little bit so I can move back into this little bush that's over on the side, which you can't really see. Sorry. Adding some blue to it and neutralizing it a little bit with some red to get more of the shadow colors. Really, the brush strokes and the way I'm painting it is pretty much the same as everything else that I painted. Trying to vary up the size and shapes of those little marks. Got your darker dark down at the bottom to give some shadow under there. There's also some shadow right there in the water. So I'm adding that dark there, using it to shape the edge of the far bank and the sunlit rocks. And really how much you decide to add is up to you. You can go into smaller and smaller detail or stop when your brush strokes are real big. Alizarin Crimson. I like to have Alizarin Crimson on my palette. It's an easy way to get those darker shades, but you can actually just take your red, if you're using a Napthol Red or a Quin Red, and add a little bit of Ultramarine Blue to it, and you get something similar. Adding a few stems here with my liner brush. That's a long, thin brush, and whenever I use that liner brush, I add more water to the paint to get it more of a inky consistency. It'll flow a lot better off your brush if you do that. That's the only time I add water to the paint, unless I'm trying to do a wash or something very thin. But in general, I use the paint with the thickness straight from the tube. So adding a bunch of red to that green will automatically make kind of a brown color. And then if you add a little more blue to that, that's going to gray it down. I'm working on these underwater rocks, so there's rocks along the edge there that are underwater. And this is really a process of experimenting. You want the color to be that sort of mucky yellow, greenish, bluish brown color, and then a few different values of that color. But truly just experimenting and seeing what starts to look right is the best way to do it. Definitely want a good amount of blue because it is under the water. And what happens is the rocks that are further away are going to be smaller, of course, and thinner little strokes. And then as you move forward and you're looking more down on the water, then those rocks are going to get rounder in shape. Adding both of my blues there, alizarin and phthalo and white. And then I neutralized it down with a little bit of that mucky dark I've got going on up there. I've gone back to my number 2 flat brush now, the small flat. And now I'm checking my reference photo and seeing where I see those blue reflected areas. So what's going to happen is in the sunlight, that blue is going to be lighter, and in the shadow it'll be darker. And here I'm putting in the sky, obviously, shaping the tops of those trees with that very light blue sky color. That's pretty much the last little piece on here that doesn't have anything on it. Well, there's still a little bit down in the water, but adding in those sky holes. Now coming back to the water, as that very sky I just put in is now being reflected into the water. You notice as I work in the water I'm using those horizontal strokes because that's the way the water lays. So as in when putting in the reflections, I was pulling straight down with the brush, but when I put in the water and getting that back and forth feeling, those horizontal shapes in the water is important. Constantly checking above to see if my reflections are representing what's above accurately. Now we got that bright blue in the shadow, which is there to kind of spark things up a little bit back in the shadows. You want to be careful when you're painting things that are in shadow not to get your colors too dull. You actually get some really pretty color in the shadows, whereas in the sunlight will tend to kind of wash colors out. But in the shadows you can get those rich chromatic colors. Some alizarin, some ultramarine blue, more varieties of the dark colors. Doing some negative painting on this bush, trying to get it to look a little more bush-like. Just referring back to that photo and squinting my eyes and trying to see where are the dark shapes and where are the lighter shapes. Putting some dark green in there as a reflection of the trees back in the background. Using that dark green where it felt like the color was a little too blue in that area. And remember, your reflections, they don't have to be super exact, but because the water is moving a little bit and distorting the image. And the more movement the water has, the more distorted the image. some mid-color, mid-value warm greens there. Remember, if your greens are looking too bright, add a little red to them, the complementary color, and that will make them a little bit more neutral and warm them up at the same time. Adding some random brownish dark strokes in there. You don't want to put too much detail in the front. You want to keep, unless your foreground is your focal point, which doesn't happen very often, but you want to keep that foreground a little bit loose so that it doesn't draw attention. More blue shadows, more comparing what's above to what's below, and lining up those shadows a little bit better. It's easy to get lost trying to figure out what colors go where. So we're getting pretty close to finishing up with this session on the painting. Adding in these few lighter details, a little bit more here and there. What I tend to do is do a session like this and then leave it for the next day or a couple of days as I look at the painting and notice the things that maybe I've stopped noticing because I've been working on it for a while. And then I can come back and do the finishing touches. So right now I'm just working a little bit more on those areas of the water that are reflecting the sunlight, and they're also getting a lot of sunlight, so they're lighter. And maybe there's a little more disturbance in the water, which is what I'm putting in now. All those little squiggly lines around where the rocks are, because those rocks near the surface and underneath, those would be disturbing the water a little bit more and causing a few more ripples. They also really help to, I think, make it feel more like water, especially where you have the reflections. If you bring those little ripples over the top of the reflections, then that pushes them down under the surface. Pretty easy to overdo it with these ripples because they're so much fun to put in. But it's a matter of taste and your own, what looks good to you, and that's what's most important. Okay, a little more bright yellow-green. Dealing with those acrylics that are drying darker, almost always have to come back in with a couple more layers of your lightest colors. In the next section, where I'm working on the final adjustments, I have pushed the painting back up 100% in the screen, so you'll be able to see more of these marks then, but they are all pretty much the same as all the other brush strokes I've been using. Just different colors. Different sizes. A little bit of reflection down underneath that bush. I want to keep it nice and warm because it's a long ways in the foreground. Right. Getting close to winding up this section. You know, you can just keep, the more you look, the more you see things that you want to change and add just a little bit more. Okay, here we go. New session, clean palette, and we're back to what the things that I noticed that I wanted to work on. And there were only a few. You've noticed I've pre-mixed my some green there in the middle from my Ultramarine Blue and my yellow, and I've mixed an orange, and I've mixed a very reddish purple. So what I decided, the area that was bothering me was this area of the rocks, especially because it's our focal point. I felt like it didn't have quite enough detail. And by detail, really, I mean variations, subtle variations in colors and shapes in there. So I'm mixing up a few shadow tones and get more of those darker shadows behind that sunlit tree so that I can get a little bit more contrast there, and that brings your eye more into that area. I also wanted to work on these rocks in front of this tree. There were a number of these rocks in our reference photo there. Some are in shadow and some have a little sunlight on them, and they added a lot of interest to this area, so I wanted to add a few more of those in there and do that by starting out with the dark color. I used pretty much exclusively the Ultramarine Blue this time around instead of the Phthalo. And I pretty much only put the Phthalo when I was working with the water. That's when I used that. Lightening up some of those reflections in the shadows in the rocks a little bit. So if everything gets too dark, you lose all of your interest down there. So some blue, ultramarine blue into my mixed orange there. Some more yellow, some more white. To get us a shadow color, sort of more of that. In the sunlit areas of the rocks, there's some variations of slightly darker areas, so that's what I was going for. Adding a bunch of white, something I work with, I struggle with myself and try to keep reminding myself is mix up bigger piles of paint. I'm always and forever mixing up a little bit of paint and I get the exact right color, and then I don't have enough of it and I have to start from scratch again. But also in putting the paint down on your canvas, if you have more paint on your brush, you're going to get a smoother stroke and a more confident brush stroke. Painting is a lot about just discovering, just trying things out. Trial and error. Getting some very, very light, almost white. Get some, that's going to help the form on those rocks. Getting those darks, mediums, and lights. Bringing in that high contrast there again helps to make the focal point more interesting and draw the eye there a little bit more. Some mid-tone colors, mid-tone grayish blues, adding that orange to gray the blue, so you get a color that's in between in value, and you get those warms and cools playing off each other. You get the warmer, more peachy colored light, and then the cooler, bluer colored light, and those react to each other, play off each other, make the rocks more interesting. Because you really do get you get some more of the sky reflecting onto those hard surfaces of the rocks too, especially where they're wet. Looking for the reflections of those lights I just put in, and the reflections of the shadows. I'm noticing that I'd kind of missed those reflections of the shadowed side of the rock there, so I'm adding those in. I like to try to move quickly when I'm working with reflections too, so that I can blend them out a little bit while they're still a little bit wet. Rinsing out my brush, drying it off, and then blending those edges. Pulling down and then going across horizontally. Just muss them up a little bit. It's always a matter of choice, that's where your artistic eye comes in. So how much of this kind of detail do you want to put in, and or do you just want to leave it loose? And that's really goes a long ways towards your style, along with a lot of other things, but some dark there underneath the rocks. Settle them down. More of those slightly lighter shadow colors, giving you interest in forms and shapes within the shadow. Alright, pretty happy with the rocks now. Now I felt like those trees needed a little more foliage and some variation of color on the trunks. Basically, I had just taken that one dark, very dark to make the tree trunks. So decided to add a little bit of browns, give it a little bit more variety. Add a couple of branches coming off the sides. And then I can add a few twigs. There's a clump of bushes down there at the base of the trees, and they were kind of blending all together. It was kind of difficult to note that they were separate. So I want to do something to separate those. Adding a little more foliage onto our focal point trees. Give them a little more presence with that very dark green color. And then add a little bit of white and a little bit of yellow to lighten it up. Warming it way up there. So I wanted a difference in the color of the bushes. So by adding that orange, I neutralize it and change that green so you can tell it's something different. There I put too much green, so I just put a little water on my paper towel and wiped that green off. It had it going over, the reflection going over further than the bush was. Adding in the tree trunks in the reflection. Just a little hint. And then some more of that foliage that I added. Remember, your reflections are, the darks will be lighter in the reflection, so they're not necessarily going to be the exact same value. They'll be a little bit lighter, and your lights will be a little bit darker. Alright, let's get some light greens, warm greens, adding orange to it and white. So let's see if we can get this sunlit tree to pop a little bit more. I also decided to use that same color on the sunlit side of the shadowed trees because I wasn't sure. It seems to me they're the same kind of a tree, and I don't know why I had it two different colors there. Just getting that to pop a little bit more, and then adding some of that into our bush as well. I'm actually kind of getting rid of some of the smaller shapes that I used over there, making some larger shapes, because I felt like it was getting a little too fussy for something that's just in the foreground, and we don't want a lot of attention brought to it. Lighter yet. You notice I wiped my brush off after I'd been mixing with it because it was just big globs of paint up near the base of the bristles, and it's really hard to get a nice clean brush stroke that way, so periodically I'll just take my paper towel and wipe that off, and so I can get a clean brush stroke. So that I think helps that area to pop a little bit better and feel like a focal point. It just felt a little too unfinished for me. But again, not necessarily for everyone. Alright, some orange with some green added and some blue. Because this area in the foreground with the rocks underneath the surface, I also felt needed some work. It was just kind of confusing and fussy to me. So I'm reestablishing some dark, mucky, orangey, greeny colors. I also wanted to put a couple of them above the surface. That's always helpful. So these are the rocks that are going to go above the surface, starting with the dark, then a mid-tone. But I decided that that gray was too neutral that I used, so I'm mixing up more of a purplish color. And trying to find the forms of those rocks. Rocks really kind of tell you what they want to be. You just have to try some brush strokes and see how they look. Got some blue shadows on the back, varying up the colors. There's all kinds of different colors in rocks. So these are the rocks that are dry and above the water line, and I think that will help. Having some above the water line will help let you know that the others are below the water line, I think. We'll see. Adding a little more red to that mucky bluish, greenish, yellowish color. And then lightening it up. Adding a little yellow. So you get the feeling that the rocks under the water also have some form. And they need some darks as well. Remember, bigger, rounder shapes towards the foreground and thinner, smaller shapes as you move away. Warming up that color as I add the lighter colors, adding a little more green to it to represent how the color of the water, all that mucky, mossy stuff that's under the water. Just create some texture. As long as you get the darks, the mediums, and the lights going on, then you get some variety. Just looks like there's different shapes under there. Orange with a little bit of blue to neutralize it. Restate those lights till we get a shape that looks good. Alright, we got some blues again. Deciding how much of that. Got to put those ripples going over the top of those to push them back down under the water surface. And get that tree comes down in front of those shadows, so I wanted to get that in there. Some more darks, back and forth, covering up a lot of the little water ripples that I made, but they're easy to put back in. Rinsing the brush, coming back over it, that wet, slightly wet paint, adding a little blue. I'll get some lighter ripples right around the edges of the rocks. And lighter yet. Gotta feel the movement of the water when you put these in. Feel that soft, rippling movement. And back here too, where you have some lighter stuff around where the rocks are in sunlight. Getting real close to the end of this little one. Hope you guys have enjoyed painting with me today. And please do, if you are a Facebook user, please do follow my Facebook group. It's called Paint with Karen, as I'd love to see how your paintings turned out. You can share them with the other people. So there I added some of that mucky watercolor, and I thinned it down with water so it was just a wash. And I put that over the top and then wiped it back off. And that helps also to kind of put a haze over the rocks and make them look more like they're underwater. Our final touches of pretty much pure white right around our focal area in the sunlight. So there we have it. There's our little sunny river scene. Thanks for joining me today. Happy painting, everyone.